Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of FitRx. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Dennis. I always enjoy talking to other physicians who just have a heart for preventative medicine. And so my next guest today is Dr. Thomas Hemingway, M.D. He is a emergency room physician, but has kind of which he still does that. I'll let him kind of tell a little more about that, but he has kind of pivoted and does a little bit more prevention now, and is coming out with a book called Preventable, 5 Powerful Practices to Avoid Disease and Build Unshakable Health, which is what we are going to talk about today. So Dr. Hemingway, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Dr. Greg. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Super pumped.
Yeah. Well, I guess my first question is tell me or tell us about your journey of just transitioning more into preventative healthcare. I mean, because obviously they just don't teach us much that in medical school, or don't stress that much. And so you're a working emergency physician. And so how did you go from that to kind of getting over in the, prevention space?
Yeah, no, I'd love to speak to that. And actually, if it's okay, I'd love to even go back a little bit farther in time with how sort of this, interest in health and wellness and, how it all started for me as a kid. So, growing up, I always loved to learn about the human body. And when I was 7 years old, I had a pretty unique experience. Now, I always have loved spending time with family. And one afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with my grandfather, and he was diabetic. He was actually type 1 diabetic. And I didn't really know this at the time. I was pretty young. I was 7. We were just having a little chat summer afternoon, and he pricked his finger and checked his blood sugar. And I was like, "What the heck are you doing, Grandpa? Why are you poking your finger?" I saw the blood come out. He used that to put it in his glucometer at the time. And he called me Tommy. That was, most people don't call me that, but my grandfather did. He said, "Hey, Tommy, I want you to be able to spend time with me as you grow up. I want to watch you grow up." And I didn't think too much about it. I'm like, "Well, sure, of course you're going to be around grandpa." And what I didn't know is that a lot of diabetics, especially like him that had juvenile onset diabetes, end up with a lot of complications that, of course, you and I can speak to, things like amputations and kidney disease, being on dialysis, things like that. And he basically told me right then and there that he was in charge of his health. He was going to pay attention. And he lived until he was 94 years old. And so it's a remarkable story. I also had another gentleman in my youth who had type 1 diabetes. He was a scout leader of mine. And this guy, I loved him. He was full of life. He used to pick me up in the mornings. We'd play basketball at 5 a.m. prior to school. I mean, he was a great guy, but he didn't really take control of his life. And he actually died in his 40s. From lots of complications. He was on dialysis. He lost his vision, had several amputations. He had a similar type of diabetes as did my grandfather, who lived until his mid 90s, yet he didn't really, take control of it. He didn't take charge of it. And he didn't really use, those tools that are available if people know what they are. And so this kind of inspired me as a kid to really want to help people to live a better life. And so I went to medical school. I loved emergency care. I loved helping people in a time of crisis. I loved to be the guy that could, go from one room where I could reduce somebody's shoulder dislocation. They pop their shoulder out of socket. I could put it back in for them. The very next room might be somebody having a heart attack, and I could help them too. And the next room might be somebody having a stroke, and I knew how to help them. And a couple of years ago, it wasn't one day in particular, but I started to see a lot of young people, and I say young because they were younger than I. I'm turning 50 next year, and I started to see 30 and 40-year-olds kind of regularly coming in with what's called an ST elevation MI, which is a big heart attack. This is the type that people can die from, the type that cause often sudden death. And I just thought to myself, what is going on here? When I did my training, this was more something that was happening in 60s and 70s and 80-year-old patients. And now routinely, I was seeing this happen in 30s and 40s and early 50s, like my age or younger. And I thought, oh my gosh, something has got to change. We're just not doing quite right in this country with respect to healthcare. It's really more sick care. And I'll be honest, in the ER, I really feel like we have great medical care. We can treat things in the moment that are life threatening, whether it be from a trauma, a car accident, an injury, something like that, or if you're in the throes of having a heart attack, we can help you in that immediate and dire situation. However, over 90% of all the health outcomes and health dollars that are spent in this country are from chronic medical conditions. In fact, in the world right now, 7 out of 10 of the most common causes of death, which include heart disease, which is the number one killer worldwide, are almost entirely preventable. And so I decided to kind of pivot and take a different approach, because I really feel like many of these conditions that end up in the emergency rooms of our country and other countries can be prevented. And why not prevent this? Why not help people to avoid the suffering that occurs from, say, a premature death from heart disease, or premature death from be it a diabetic complication or a cancer? Many cancers are preventable as well. So I kind of pivoted and I began really approaching health from a prevention over a prescription standpoint. And it's been wonderful. The last couple of years, I've really focused on integrative approaches to help people prevent these diseases that too commonly ail us. So that's kind of the long-winded answer, but I hope that helps.
Yeah. Yeah, very nice. I'm always surprised that there's just more physicians that don't do that. And I guess the reason I'm surprised is because our kind of standard of healthcare speaks for itself. I mean, the outcomes speak for themselves, which is horrible. I mean, you mentioned, yeah, we do great in acute situations, but chronic diseases, we do absolutely terrible. And, I'm surprised, there's just more physicians who just don't question that and question things. And I did it. I mean, people have heard my story, my listeners, but I did it for years and years. Just the status quo, had my blinders on, never really thought anything about it until one day I just kind of had this epiphany of like, this isn't working real well. There's got to be a better way. And that's kind of when I went on my own journey and discovered, more prevention and just some different ways of doing things. But are you surprised that there are just not more physicians who kind of question the standard of care?
Well, I mean, not as surprised as maybe I should be. I mean, I came from that Western approach where in medical school we were taught, the physiology, the pathophysiology, and sort of a treatment-driven approach with pharmaceuticals primarily for a symptom, right? If your blood sugar was elevated, you did something about that. You never really went deep to determine why somebody's blood sugar was elevated in the first place. And in medical school, we learned about type 1 diabetes, which is the one that generally starts younger in life, for example, that the pancreas isn't working, you don't have appropriate insulin. We also learned about type 2 diabetes, which is, of course, the more common one nowadays. In fact, up to 50% of the developed world now has either diabetes type 2 or pre-diabetes, elevated blood sugar. And that is just astounding. I mean, those numbers are crazy. 74% of us in this country are classified actually as being overweight. And so I understand where most physicians are coming from, because we weren't trained to really think to what are the ultimate sort of root causes of disease. We were trained to recognize disease. Oh, somebody's blood pressure is elevated. Oh, the labs say this, and boom, go to a treatment right away. But we never really were taught much about nutrition and prevention. I mean, we had classes in prevention, but very rare compared to the numbers of hours we spent doing pharmacology or pathophysiology. And so I understand where physicians are coming from, but what is a little bit frustrating is many of them are just okay with that sort of approach. And I don't understand how they cannot realize the trajectory of where health, or should I say sickness, is going in this country. For example, in the last decade, obesity rates have nearly doubled. Right now, like I mentioned, just the probability of being overweight in this country is 73.4%, 73.6%, actually. That's 2018 data from the CDC. And that has basically doubled in the last 15 years or so. And so why they can't, in general, look at that and go, our current treatment models are not working, is kind of beyond me. It's kind of surprising to try to come to grips with that. And I have a couple of theories on it, but I understand where they're coming from. They're generally, physicians are trained a certain way. They're trained how to, recognize problems. And right away, they generally go to a prescription pad to try to treat those problems. And they don't really dig deeper and get to the root of what causes the issue in the first place. And so I get where they're coming from, but something's got to change.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, so you kind of got into this a little bit more and then decided to write a book. So you wrote a book called Preventable. And so tell us, I guess, a little bit about your motivation to write the book, and then let's get into, because you mentioned there's 5 powerful practices to avoid disease. And so I guess just give us number 1 and we can maybe go through those one at a time.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. And so the motivation, was sort of this overlying desire to help people avoid some of these common ailments that exist. And over the last, I would say 2 decades, these have transitioned a bit. So, maybe 20, 30 years ago, we still had infectious diseases common in the top 10 causes of death worldwide. We had hunger, for example, as well, and lack of nutrition in that respect. Now, these things have changed. So in the world today, 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death are almost entirely preventable. And they include, number 1, as mentioned, heart disease. And that's just about every country worldwide. Second, it's typically either stroke or cancer. Then you have diabetes and complications associated with that, obesity, kidney disease. I think I mentioned stroke already. And you don't really have much for infectious disease in the top 10 other than a general sort of respiratory infection, which pre-COVID was either pneumonia in the elderly, for example. And now, of course, in the recent couple of years of pandemic, we still have respiratory illnesses there as well. But most of them, 7 out of 10, in fact, of the leading causes of death are really almost entirely preventable. So that recognizing that and that starting to see younger and younger people have these conditions that I saw in my training in older folks, and I say older kind of loosely, older meaning say over 60, for example, is where I used to see most people with heart disease or stroke or even neurocognitive disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Now we're seeing people in their 50s with these illnesses, and the age just keeps dropping. And so as I started to see this more routinely working in the emergency rooms of America, mostly in California and Hawaii, I just thought, gosh, we got to do something different. We got to do something better. And I really started digging into this, and most of the approaches I was learning came from sort of a functional or integrative medicine approach, which is one that looks for that root cause, one that looks a little deeper to what is causing somebody to have maybe type 2 diabetes or heart disease, for example. It's not just in the genes. We used to think, and maybe you were taught this way as well, but in medical school, it was all about the genes. And of course, for me, this was way before the Human Genome Project was completed, and everything was sort of in the DNA, we were taught, and we didn't understand that the rest of it, the so-called epigenetic influences, which is all the environmental factors, which is what we do or what we don't do or what we're exposed to or not exposed to, that actually is more important than the actual genetic material we possess. In other words, in the last 2 decades, it's been recognized and appreciated that the epigenetic component, which is all these other environmental factors and the choices we make, is really about 90% of whether we come down with a certain disease or not. Call it heart disease, call it cancer. And there's still some genetic disorders that really, don't match this percentage. But for the most part, when you take just diseases in general, about 90% of them are affected within this epigenomic respect. In other words, it's not just the DNA you inherited from your parents. You just can't blame them for all your health troubles, right? Just because you're overweight and your parents are overweight doesn't mean you got the gene from them per se. Most of that is environmental, and it's the choices you make or don't make and the things you do and don't do. So that's kind of what drove me to really write this book, because I really feel like this message needs to get out there, not only to just average people, but also, physicians and practitioners to realize that there's actually so much we can do, right? If 90% of this is in our own court, so to speak, that's super empowering. A lot of us say, I'm of the age where I could easily have hypertension, or I could easily be overweight. In fact, 74% of my age group is overweight. I'm not, but I could be. And so I understand how common these things are, and to recognize that 90% of this is within our control. I just think is so empowering for people. And so I decided to kind of distill this down into 5 practices, which, if done daily, if we look at these things daily, we can really get down to the roots of most illness, and we can prevent a lot of these not only life-threatening conditions, but also improve one's life in the interim, right? We're not just looking at living longer, which is increasing lifespan. We're looking at living longer in the most healthy way possible, or increasing our health span. And personally, I have the goal to live to be 120 years old. And so I want to live at least to 100 still surfing. I'm an avid surfer. I surf daily when I'm anywhere near a water source. And I have the personal goal to surf until I'm 100 years old.
Oh,
And I know
wow.
that to do that, I have to do a few things, because that's not just naturally going to occur. I mean, yeah, my grandfather lived till he was 93 or 94. My grandmother into her 90s as well. But that's not the only thing that comes into play. I mean, he had diabetes, for crying out loud. Most people don't live that long with diabetes. And so I distilled it down into 5 practices. And like any good physician that went to medical school, I love mnemonics as much as anybody else. So these sort of memory aids to help, make this super simple. So I developed a mnemonic, which is real easy to remember. It's FMSGs. So FMSG with an S at the end, because everybody hates MSG anyway, and we should. It's not good for us. There's a lot of problems associated with it. So the F is food, and so first and foremost, I think every health plan, every desire to get healthy should include a real food, a whole foods diet. And I'm of the practice that it's not so much that there's all these things to avoid. There's really only 3 things to avoid. I like to keep it simple, because I like to use this adding rather than subtracting approach. Many people, go on a diet of one sort or another. And what happens? Well, in the short term, doesn't matter what kind of diet you go on, almost every diet works in the short term. However, at the 6 month, 1 year, 2 year, 5 year mark, almost all diets, doesn't matter what kind, they almost all fail. And in fact, a study out of UCLA a couple of years back, I believe 2018, showed that the most likely thing that going on a diet would predict was future weight gain. Think about that. Future weight gain. The more often you go on a diet, the more likely you are to gain weight in the future. Like, holy crap, what's going on there? That's the opposite of what we want, right? And so food first is my first pillar, which is that the really the thing to focus on is just eat real food. The things that you can get at the supermarket in the perimeter that don't even need a label, that you just look at it and you know what it is. It's some kind of a vegetable, some kind of a fruit, it's some kind of a well-raised protein, for example, wild caught fish or what have you. It's things that don't need an ingredients list, right?
Hmm.
It's really, really easy. And the 3 things to avoid are, number one, the highly processed grains. So you can think of the glutens and all the other super highly processed grains. 2, the sugars, the highly processed ones, especially like high fructose corn syrup. And it's frustrating because when people read a label, there's like 20 different names for sugar. You have rice bran sugar, you have cane sugar, you have all these different versions of sugar, but sugar is not awesome for the body, especially if ingested in the quantities that we ingest it, between 30 and 60 pounds of sugar per year, depending on what study you look at. I mean, it's a lot of sugar that we ingest, these highly processed carbs. The third to avoid is what are called the seed oils, which is basically anything that says vegetable oil, the soybean oil, the safflower, the sunflower, the canola, the corn oil, the cottonseed oil, all of these, which are likely found in anything with a label, right? The most common ingredients of anything that comes with a label are some kind of processed grain, some kind of processed sugar, like high fructose corn syrup or what have you, and some kind of seed oil, especially the soybean oil. So those are really only the 3 things that I really stress for people to avoid. And then they can eat basically almost anything else. And there's so many varieties. Did you know that there are over 6,000? In fact, the recent study, I forget the most recent one, but there are in the world thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of edible plants. And we as humans eat less on average than 200 of them. In fact, beyond that, there are 3 plants in this world that occupy almost 60% of all calories consumed by humans. 3 plants. You can probably guess what those are, and I'm sure the listeners can too, right? It's things like wheat, corn, and rice. And then a close fourth place is soy. So literally those 4 plants occupy over 60% of the calories that are eaten by humans on this earth. And there's tens of thousands of edible food sources out there. I mean, it's just insane how limited we are. So I really stress this adding food to the diet. Like, you hear the expression, eat the rainbow, for example, eat all the colorful things. There's so many of them. I mean, go to a farmer's market and try to every week add 1 or 2 new things that you've never eaten before. Hopefully there's some version of fresh produce or fruits or well-raised meats or proteins, things like that. Like it can really be that easy. So that's the F.
That's number
Anything
one.
you wanted to comment with respect to food?
No, I mean, I agree 100%. And that's what I tell people. Now, I do kind of, lean more towards the lower carb, just, I'm primary care doc. And as
Yeah.
you mentioned, most people are insulin resistant, especially where I live in the Midwest. It's even worse. I think Oklahoma is number 2, maybe, or 3, just behind Mississippi and maybe Alabama as far as the most obese and the most insulin resistant. So at least starting off, I like people kind of lower carb, but I tell them the exact same thing. Don't get confused with a particular type of diet, being on this diet or that diet. Eat whole, real foods. If you do that, you're going to be ahead of 99% of the people out there. So give us an example, if you
that's
will.
super true.
Yeah. So give us an example, if you will, of just what your daily food looks like. Like what do you eat? You said you're going to try to live really long. Like what's a typical kind of breakfast, lunch, and dinner look like for you?
Okay, cool. I love to talk about this because it's pretty simple, and it's not only what I eat, but it's what my kids eat. And I think that's the powerful thing too. Anybody who has kids or has family members they spend time with, I think initially it can be a little challenging, right? Because you may have a pantry that has a bunch of things that you got in the center of the supermarket, which is all the things that come in a bag or with a box or with a barcode, they have a long ingredients list. And the reason they're there is because they have an extended shelf life, because those processed grains, flours, sugars, and seed oils help that to occur. So start where you are. You don't have to necessarily toss everything in your pantry, but start shopping more on the perimeter, which is where I get 95% of my food items. So here's what it looks like for me. So first thing in the morning, I tend to get up pretty early, usually about 5, and I'm not hungry when I wake up. So I don't eat anything right away. I usually drink about 16 to 20 ounces of water, and that really kind of gets me alert, wakes me up, hydrates me, because I try not to drink a lot of water at night because I'm coming up on 50. And if I do, I'm peeing a couple times a night. And I don't want to wake up to pee because it disrupts my sleep, and sleep's super important. So I get up, drink a full glass of water. I usually do a workout of some type, just kind of depends on where I am in the world. If I'm in Hawaii, which I am often, I go surfing, and I don't eat any calories at least prior to surfing. I drink a full glass of water, go for a surf for a couple hours, get home. So usually anywhere between, I would say, 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. or lunchtime, that's where my first meal is. And I do a breakfast. Personally, I love breakfast foods. And when I say that, I don't mean traditional American breakfast food. So I don't eat, bagels and croissants and cereals and oatmeal. I don't eat any of those things. I'm very much on a low carb program. So what I eat almost every day are pasture raised eggs, and I have 3 to 5 of them, depending on how hungry I am. And for a lot of people, they might be like, oh my gosh, that's too many eggs. Well, they're from a well-raised source. They have healthy fats in them, the cholesterol we actually need for our brain, for example. So I'm not worried about cholesterol. I eat between 3 and 5 eggs in the morning. And usually I do kind of empty the fridge, kind of an omelet, if you will. So if I had leftovers from the prior evening, whether it be vegetables that I cooked up or some kind of meat, maybe I had ground beef and a taco or some kind of dish the night before, I'll kind of throw it all in and I'll just make a big omelet. So it's kind of fun because every day it's a little different. Just sort of depends on what leftovers I have to use. And typically I'll use eggs, I'll use some vegetables, I'll use some sort of protein or meat source in there. And I'll eat that almost every single morning, some type of, clean the fridge omelet. So that's breakfast for me. Lunch, I typically have, and it just kind of depends on my day. I'm not a big lunch eater for some reason because I eat my breakfast a little bit later, between 9 and noon. So I often skip lunch. And if I get hungry, I'll just eat either 1 or 2 whole avocados Avocados are great for a natural, healthy fat source, and they're super satiating. Like if you get the little urge to eat between a meal and you eat like half an avocado or a full avocado, that should tide you over until your next meal. So I'm not a big lunch guy. But for dinner, I usually try to eat an earlier dinner, maybe about 5 or 6 p.m. at the latest. And I'll typically have some sort of a protein, which is usually either wild caught fish if I'm in Hawaii, and I just love fish. So every variety from raw fish to cooked fish to grilled fish to fish in some kind of dish or on a salad, I eat all the things. I love fish or seafood too. I actually love, I love scallops. I love mussels. I love shrimp. I love all the seafoods because they taste great to me. I was sort of born and raised eating seafood and got a lot of healthy fat, which is the omega 3s, which we're often deficient in. And then I have some sort of vegetable. I love the cruciferous ones, which are sort of the green, healthy, detoxifying vegetables like broccoli, especially broccoli sprouts. Brussels sprouts are among my favorite. Asparagus. So I eat about half of my plate of vegetables and the other half is some kind of protein, whether it be a grass-fed steak or ground beef or pasture-raised chicken or wild-caught fish. So it's a pretty simple diet. I mean, almost everything I eat is just a real whole food. I don't have much in the way of snack foods in my diet. And when I do, it's also whole food. And it's typically nuts. I love nuts. So anytime during the day, if I feel like I can't quite make it to the next meal, I reach for a handful of nuts, whether they be in Hawaii, it's typically macadamia nuts. If it's elsewhere and I can't get them, it's either cashews or walnuts or almonds. And I'll kind of snack on them throughout the day. And you probably noticed there wasn't much of any carbohydrates. The only carbohydrates I typically eat are in vegetables and fruit. And I don't even eat fruit as often as I used to because I'm focusing on kind of a low carb diet overall. I love fruit and I only eat them in season. So if it's summer, I'll eat berries or I'll eat watermelon, for example. If it's winter, I don't really eat much fruit. In Hawaii, we can get fruit most of the year. So bananas are available year round. Many people don't know this avocado. That's actually a fruit, although it's not a sweet one. And I eat plenty of those. But yeah, it's a pretty protein and a healthy fat rich diet. It's very low carb. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what my sort of food over the course of one day looks like.
Yeah, that is very low carb. And I wonder, I mean, it sounds pretty ketogenic. Are you in ketosis most of the time, or do you know, or do you care?
I used to check that back maybe 5, 6 years ago when I was kind of trying to be in ketosis most of the time. And what I found is I got used to sort of how I felt when I was in ketosis and when I didn't, and the things that would kick me out. And I'm not a full on, like, I got to be in ketosis all the time kind of guy. I like being in ketosis because I feel good. My mind is sharp. I feel energetic. But there's times where I'll eat some carbs. Once a week, I may have a dish of pasta or something like that. Typically, it's pasta that we either make ourselves homemade or somebody else makes it homemade. So I do eat pasta and some carbs, but not often. And when I do, I try to eat it towards the end of the day. I don't like to start my day with carbs, and there's some rationale to that we can talk about if you want to. But as far as ketosis goes, I'm pretty familiar with how I feel. I don't measure it anymore, but I certainly did several years back because I was curious and I wanted to see if, when I was in ketosis, if that was more healthful and I felt better. And so I kind of cycle in and out. I don't have any super strict, I have to eat less than 20 carbs today kind of thing. I don't really have that kind of a strict mantra. I eat to, what my cravings are that day. If I feel like
Yeah.
having a little bit of carbs, I do. If it's something coming from a whole food, I don't really get to,
Sure. Yeah, that's perfect.
into the measuring part.
So it sounds like you are very metabolically flexible, which is what I tell people is the ultimate goal, where you can switch back and forth from ketosis or burning carbs. And, to me, that's where you want to be. So, all right. Well, so the next one after,
100%. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
yeah. So the next one after food is M. What is the M?
M. So M is M for movement. So this
Mhm.
includes any type of movement that you can do. The old school is exercise, get your cardio, minimum 150 minutes a week type of thing. That was kind of the recommendation for many years. I've kind of moved on from that. I feel like cardio is great, but it's not enough, especially as you age. One of the biggest problems with aging is that most of us have what's called age-related sarcopenia, which is muscle loss as we get older, and it's not normal. So it's common, But I hate it when doctors say that it's just a normal part of aging. That's bullcrap. It doesn't have to be a normal part of aging. We have a choice in that. So I really focus more on strength training or resistance training. And this can be simple. Like if you have a gym membership, fantastic. I would recommend going to the gym, putting up some weight, getting a trainer if you have the ability to do that, because they can really help you with this. You want to get strong. I don't have a gym membership. I actually don't really even like gyms. I like to do things that get me strong that don't require a gym membership. And these include activities that I can either do at home. So that's body weight exercises like squats that I can do. I love, love, love to do. I don't know if any of you out there are like me, and I work at a standing desk. So I can do air squats every hour. I can drop down and do some lunges. I keep hand weights, little dumbbells at the foot of my desk. I pick them up every hour for a couple of minutes, and I put some weights in the air. I also have a bench that I can do different weight training activities on the bench. So I recommend people do minimum 2 days a week of some kind of strength training, either with some weights or with their own body weight. And it can be simple, like I was referring to. Like you can literally do air squats, or you can do burpees, or you can do lunges, or there's so many activities that you can do. My favorite actually is the pull-up. Like if you can't do one pull-up, you need to work to where you can figure out how you can get your body to do a couple of pull-ups. That's one of the best total body weight exercises. And I am turning 50 next year. I can do 20 completely slack pull-ups consecutively with no issues. My goal by the time I turn 50 in a year is to be able to do 30 in a row. So I'm not satisfied with only doing 20 in a row. I'm planning to do 30 in a row by when I turn 50. So body weight exercises are critical. There's actually a cool book out there. I'm trying to think of the author. I think it's Sal DiStefano, who wrote The Resistance Training Revolution. I think that's a great sort of entry-level book for everybody to grab that talks about the importance of strength training or using some weights. And then I would just say things that we can do easily within our day. So a lot of us work from home nowadays. And if you have a desk that you have to sit at, just change that thing into a standing desk. And if you don't have a standing desk, that's fine. I don't have it many places I am. And I just put a couple boxes on top of a regular desk, and I stand to work almost exclusively. And what that does for me is it reminds me that I need to get up and move, and I can walk in place. And I don't have a treadmill that I put under my desk or anything fancy. I just kind of walk in place and I do some exercises. I have a little alarm. I know it sounds cheesy, but every 40 minutes, my little alarm goes off and I do some kind of 2 minutes of movement. And it can be right there at my desk. I can do air squats. I can drop down and do a plank for 2 or 3 minutes. Like, just these are really simple things that you don't need an actual weight set, or you don't need anything fancy. You certainly don't need a gym membership. So that'd be my first recommendation, is just incorporate small movements into your day, whether that be as simple as putting a cardboard box on top of your desk. The other big thing I've learned to love in my recent decade of life is walking. When I was younger, I just thought walking was a waste of time. And I thought that was just what old people did. Like walking wasn't high intensity enough for me, but it's a great place to get in some movement. And one of the most important times to do some walking is after you eat. So I have a personal goal. Anytime I eat a meal, so that's 2 or 3 times a day, I go for minimum a 10-minute walk. And typically it's just around my block. I have about a 10-minute loop, about 3/4 of a mile. I just kind of walk it. And I can do that after every meal. So it can be really simple. This has been shown in the data to reduce your likelihood of having insulin resistance. It helps a lot with the postprandial spikes in both glucose and insulin. And everybody knows how to walk, right? We're bipeds. We've been walking for millennia. So it can be easy. I think everybody's heard of this mantra that sitting is the new smoking. And it's not exactly like that, but there is a direct correlation with the numbers of hours that we sit in a day. The more of them, the higher the risk of every chronic illness known to man, right? From heart disease to obesity to type 2 diabetes, cancer. All these things increase in likelihood the more we sit in a day. So just get up and move. The best kind of movement is the one that you will do daily or almost daily, 5 to 6 days a week. And just go get out there and do it. It doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah. Great advice. Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I do prefer the gym a little bit, but that's just because that's what I like. I mean, certainly not a have to kind of thing. You can certainly, build some muscle and get exercise, just like what you're saying, doing squats and push-ups and, pull-ups and things like that. So yeah, I think it's great. All right. So the first S, what is that one?
So the first S is something I struggled with for many years, and that is sleep. And I
Mm.
think the reason for that is, like most physicians, especially in the training years, it was not only something that was underappreciated, but flat out, you were basically blackballed if you slept a lot. Like I was told in my training that every hour I was sleeping, I was missing something. I was missing an educational experience. Maybe I missed seeing a certain, patient come through the hospital ER or on the wards or whatever that was because I was sleeping. And so sleeping was a sign of weakness, at least in my training. Not sure about yours, but that was kind of where I adopted this "I'll sleep when I'm dead" mentality. If anybody's a fan of The Cure, they did a song on that once. But I didn't appreciate sleep. And in fact, not to the discredit of anybody that taught me in medical school, but in those days in the 1990s, we didn't really know why sleep was so valuable. We knew that we needed to do it, and if we didn't do it, we didn't perform well on coordination tests and all sort of mental battery exams and things like that. We couldn't compute as well. We couldn't do fine motor skills and things like that. We knew it wasn't healthy in both the short and the long term. In fact, even the WHO has classified shift workers, those that are working at night and not sleeping normally, as a type 2 carcinogen. In other words, potentially cancer causing. So we've known that we've needed to sleep for a long time, but we didn't exactly know why until I think it was about 2012 when Dr. Jeffrey Iliff and Nattergaard out of the University of Rochester came up with the brain system for sweeping out all the toxins that is called the glymphatic system. And you can think of it as analogous to the lymphatic system, right? That sort of operates when we sleep primarily to get rid of all the toxins that build up during the day. And so this was sort of a light bulb moment for me when I learned this. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. They're starting to see some people show signs of dementia, like Alzheimer's, for example, in as early as their 40s and 50s. And maybe they're not so forgetful yet, but they're starting to see some of these deposits in the brain and other indicators, inflammatory markers, these kinds of things. And like, if I can start preventing this now before I have symptoms by sleeping 7 or 8 hours a night, I used to average only 5 or 6 hours a night for probably 2 decades. And then I started to pivot a little bit and value my sleep. It was a game changer. My wife would tell you that I was just kind of an unpleasant person for many years. I was just kind of cranky. I wasn't sleeping well, 4 hours a night on average throughout the whole training process. My early practice, I was super busy, worked 100 hours a week. I didn't have time to sleep. I would rather surf or be with my kids or work an extra shift or whatever it was. And I just didn't appreciate it. But what I found over the years is that sleep is one of those sort of superpowers that if we really tap into it, not only do we feel better immediately, but it is so helpful for our overall health, right? It decreases inflammation, it decreases insulin resistance. I mean, there are so many benefits for sleep that I just couldn't ignore the effects that I had seen in my own personal life and then that in my patients. And that's one of my first questions when somebody comes in and they say, "Hey, doc, I'm not able to lose this weight that I've been trying to lose. Like, I'm doing everything right. I'm exercising, I'm eating real food. And what do you think's going on?" First thing I ask them about is their sleep. How is your sleep? How many hours do you sleep? Is it great, refreshing, rejuvenative sleep where you wake up in the morning and you feel good, or you just don't, you logged in 8 hours, but maybe you were getting up 3 or 4 times during the night for whatever reason. So focusing on sleep and quality of sleep, not just quantity, I found to be a game changer in many people.
Okay.
So that's the S.
Any kind of tips or biohacks you could give us for people that are maybe struggling to sleep?
Yeah, my favorite one, and I like to focus in the book. I have several chapters on each of these topics, and I get into the data and I share all these things. But one of my favorite items is get out into the daylight in the morning hours if you can. It can be as little as 2 to 5 minutes. Without sunglasses, go for a walk, say within 2 hours of sunup, hopefully sooner to sunup, because you just get your day started. I've never met anybody that was upset with me once they had done this practice. They get outside for 2 to 5 minutes, usually around sunrise, and just go for a little walk. Let the sun hit your eyes. Don't wear sunglasses. Let the sun hit your eyes, and that will actually help set your biological clock, your circadian rhythm. The best quality sleep starts with what you do in the morning. And I know it sounds trite. It sounds, maybe it's repetitive. Maybe you say that a lot, but I found that to be super helpful. So that's one of my favorite hacks. Just get some daylight during the day, natural light hitting your eyes without sunglasses, setting your biological rhythm, your circadian rhythm. And then at night, the easiest thing is just make it a ritual. Most of us have a little bit of a ritual in the morning, right? We might do a little exercise like I do. Maybe we have sort of a practice that we do, a breathing practice, or some sort of, tackle the day thing where we have a list of high, impact items that we want to get done this particular day. Maybe it's a 5-minute gratitude. Maybe it's a meditation. A lot of us have a morning routine, but I would say not as many of us have a nighttime routine, or at least one that is really helpful for sleep. So I'd recommend people have a little bit of a nighttime routine. And it's a couple of simple steps. One is just don't eat within about 3 hours prior to bed. So have a food curfew, right? I got a couple of teenagers right now. We always talk about curfews, and one of my important curfews for my own personal life is having a food curfew. Try not to eat any significant calories within 3 hours of going to bed. And not only will that help you to sleep better, but it'll also decrease your incidence of insulin resistance and all these other metabolic issues that I'm sure you talk a lot about. So make it a routine at night. Try not to eat within about 3 hours before bed. Within 2 hours before bed, I try to kind of start toning down the activities as far as staring into computer screens and doing a lot of work. I try to tone that down. If you can't get rid of the blue lights within 2 hours, make it at least 1 hour prior to bedtime. Like if you're staring into your computer right up until the moment that you turn the lights off and go to sleep, and then you lie there and you're like, why the heck can't I go to sleep? Well, duh, those blue lights are hitting that suprachiasmatic nucleus of your brain that tells you, hey, the lights are hitting my eyes. I'm supposed to be awake. It decreases the body's ability to secrete the melatonin, which helps you get to sleep. So if you're looking at screens right up until the moment you go to bed, and you're having trouble sleeping, just start with that. Just give yourself an hour of a wind down ritual, whatever that is for you. Maybe just read a book. Maybe it's sit in a bath or a hot tub or go for a super mellow walk around your neighborhood. Whatever that is, have a journal that you write and have some kind of routine where you're not looking at a screen. I try to shoot for 2 hours prior to bed. I don't always succeed. So my minimum is kind of 1 hour before bed. And if you have to do some work and you got to look at a screen, get some blue light blocking glasses and still give yourself 1 hour. So that's kind of my bare minimum. And then just all the usual stuff, right? Have a cold room, have a dark room, block out all the ambient light, the ambient noises. If you got to sleep with earplugs or an eye shade, like do that, whatever it is to keep that. I call it a sleep sanctuary. You want it cool, you want it dark, you want it quiet and free from distractions. So that's kind of a starting point. And those tips are all free, by the way. They don't cost anything to do that, right? Unless you got to go out and buy some blackout curtains, or you can do the Elvis thing and put some tinfoil in the window, right?
Yeah. That's great advice. And that's exactly what I tell people. Do you recommend any magnesium at night? That's one of them that I usually recommend.
Magnesium is my favorite. It's one of my favorite minerals because most of us, as you know, are functionally deficient in magnesium anyway. I would say at least 70% of us could benefit from magnesium. So why not take it at night? I typically prefer a magnesium threonate. Because that happens across the blood-brain, border, and so you can get it absorbed better into the brain, which helps with the relaxation phase. I mean, mag-glycinate is great too. Those are sort of my top 2 recommendations for people. But yeah, almost anybody can benefit from magnesium, and especially at night. So 100% agree.
Yep, great. Well, okay. Number 4 is a G. What's that one?
G. So this one's kind of a fun one, and I don't know how much you talk about this, but this is gut health. So the G is your gut. You have to mind your gut. And this sort of involves a lot of the other steps, but I put it in there because we really need to focus on getting them healthy so they can help us stay healthy. So there's a synergy that can occur between the microbiota, all the organisms that live in us, on us, within us, the most of which, as you know, are located in the intestinal tract, especially the large intestinal tract. There's trillions of these bacteria mostly. There's some viruses, some protozoa, some others that are there, but mostly it's the bacteria. And if we can get them in sync with us, they can benefit us tremendously. Most people have heard about the so-called gut-brain axis and sort of the second brain. And we've kind of heard that most of the serotonin, up to 95% of that happy hormone, is produced in the gut. All of that is true. But beyond that, it's so phenomenal that based upon what microbes exist in your gut, they can basically help determine whether you're going to be lean and fit or whether you're going to be overweight. And they've done studies looking at this. They've taken, for example, a fecal transplant, right? The poop out of, say, an overweight person, and they put it into a normal mouse. And guess what happens to that mouse? They don't even change the diet, same calories, that mouse gets overweight. They can do the same thing with bacteria from the poop of somebody who's lean. They can put it into a mouse, and guess what? They stay lean. So these things, these bacteria, these little guys are so important. We cannot ignore them. So focusing both from a dietary perspective on things that will help them, which are generally sort of these really fibrous types of vegetables, which they have some carbs, but typically it's negligent, like net carbs, close to zero. Most of these things like Brussels sprouts, asparagus, these kinds of things, because they're so high fiber content, effectively, they don't have much, if any, actual carbs that are going to be spiking your blood sugar. And so these are things that feed those good bacteria in your gut, right? The things that are like lactobacillus, reuteri, which is the one that's been getting a lot of press, Akkermansia, for example. These are great gut bugs that help you in so many ways. They can produce vitamins, they can produce the serotonin, they produce these short chain fatty acids, which help our enteric cells, which are our intestinal cells, to stay tight and not be leaky. You probably talked about leaky gut on your podcast, which, it's one of those things that I didn't learn in medical school. I don't think that name even existed, 25 years ago, but we now know that that's a true thing. And it's at the root of many chronic diseases, from inflammatory diseases like, all the arthritides, the arthritis, the lupus, the things like that, to gut disorders like inflammatory bowel. And even those that are less severe, like IBS, which many people have, can all be related to their gut health. So you gotta focus on your gut. And the cool thing is most of the other healthy practices will help in that respect. Whether or not you get daylight in the day, that actually helps your gut microbes too. They have a circadian rhythm, like who knew? So these things are super powerful. They shouldn't be avoided, and they can really help us with a lot of synergy. So I dedicate several chapters in the book on how to get your gut healthy. Really, it's really fascinating stuff. I don't know if you talk about that much with your patients, but I just find it so fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Well, very good. And then lastly, we got one more S. What's the last S?
So the last S is stress, and it's stress optimization. I think anybody would agree that in recent years, say the last 2 to 3 years of the pandemic, the stress levels of society in general have increased. There was a study done in 2012, which looked at the average number of stressful events per year, to the average American. And at that point in time, it was like 70 some odd % of them had a significant life stress in a calendar year. They've looked at that again in COVID times, and it's up to 87 or so %. So it's increasing. Stress can happen to all of us. We can't necessarily, will it on or off of ourselves. It just happens in a lot of cases. There is one cool part in this study. This was 2012, and it was of 180,000 patients. And what they had them do, and this I just find remarkable, they had them rate whether the stress was high, whether it was medium, or whether it was low. And then the second follow-up question, which was even more important, was what was the meaning of that stress? Do you believe that the stress is harmful to you? Could it actually negatively impact your health? And that was the response that most mattered. So in other words, if you take that group that had the highest amount of stress, they marked their stress as high. Those that also believed that it was bad for them, that it could be, leading to chronic health conditions, it could decrease their health, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They had a 38% increase risk of dying. However, in that same high stress group, those that believed that the stress could be something positive, it could be a growth experience, it could be empowering. Think of all the changes that came up with the last couple of years. Many of us had to pivot, our types of business. We had to figure out how to work from home. Brick and mortars turned to online businesses, things like that. Those that pivoted and used that stress as something positive, as a growth experience, for them, that high stress was actually protective. In other words, they did not have an increased risk of dying. They actually had a decreased risk of dying, as well as decreased risk of many of the health problems that we see today: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, these kinds of things. They had a decreased risk. So the first part about stress is we have a significant impact on what that'll look like in us. And it lies right between the ears. We get to decide the meaning we attach. It's powerful. But beyond that, there's lots of super useful and even free strategies to be able to combat the stress that we have, right? There's breath work. I love focusing on that because you can literally change your physiological state in 6 breaths, right? You can take a breath in, hold that for 4 seconds, and breathe out over 4 seconds. Do this so-called box breathing. And within 6 breaths, that happens in just under a minute, you can literally change your whole perspective, not only mentally, but hormonally, and this has been measured, where in such a short period of time with breath work, you can change the so-called milieu that exists in your body, right? The hormonal factors, the cortisol, the adrenalines, and then the good sort of anti-stress hormone people are starting to talk about, which is oxytocin, that can be released in really brief intervals of time with breath work, with meditation, with gratitude. You know, if you're into journaling, that's a wonderful way to do that. My favorite is connection. And this can be connection with people, having a chat. It can be connection with your favorite canine or feline friend. If you want to just cuddle with your dog or cat, that actually is one of the best anti-stress things that you can do. It releases oxytocin. You know, getting into groups online where you're supportive and you're helpful, or just walking down the street on your usual after meal walk, and you see somebody, you say hello to them, you smile. Like these simple things of connection are so powerful in releasing that anti-stress hormone oxytocin. So I devote an entire chapter to all these techniques and things that you can do to reduce stress. And it's just been a game changer for so many people, including myself. I love talking about optimizing stress because we're all going to get it, but it's how we choose to respond to it that really matters in the end.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's good stuff. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on everything. If I were to write a book, which I've entertained the idea, but I just don't know where I'd find the time right now. But I would put in there everything you just had. So now I don't need to write a book because you've done it for me. So that's great. So the book is called Preventable. It's not quite out yet. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's not out yet. It's finished. It's in the final editing. We were going to release it actually this month, but we decided to release it the 1st of January because most people are sort of more health conscious in the new year. So look for it 1st of January. It's Preventable. There's actually a website you can go to sign up for any info on its release. I'm going to be doing some book signings and things like that in a couple of locations across the country. Easiest way is just hop on over to my website, which is just my name, ThomasHemingway.com. And there's a link there for the book where you can sign up for notifications about when it's coming out and whatnot. If it comes out earlier, you'll be the first to know right there. You can also check out my podcast, which is Unshakeable Health. And I do weekly episodes as well. And so they can find me there. I usually will announce any sort of upcoming events there, and my Instagram, which is just Dr. Thomas Hemingway, which is DR, and then my name, Thomas Hemingway. So yeah, those are the easiest places to find me to get more on the book. There is also a website called thepreventablebook.com that you can go to as well. You can see the cover and little tidbit on there. And so any of those locations would be great to follow that. Thanks for mentioning it.
Awesome. Yeah. And I forgot to mention that you host a podcast. And so it's called Unshakeable Health. How long have you been doing that? And tell us just a little bit about that podcast. I mean, I'm sure you talk health and wellness, probably similar to what I do, but tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So this was something that I started doing in the early days. I think it was March of 2019. So I'm coming up on 3 years. We have well over 100 episodes, lots of basically health strategies, mostly natural strategies that don't involve pharmaceuticals and things like that, just natural approaches to a lot of topics that people are interested in, things like metabolic health. You mentioned, how to get metabolically flexible. I've done a couple of podcasts on that, for example. I've done podcasts on sleep. I've done a couple on sort of stress optimization, lots of them on food and nutrients and nutraceuticals and behavioral things we can do on exercise and movement, the things that people can really do to move the needle in their health that are simple, that are generally speaking, almost every technique I talk about is free, doesn't cost any investment. Those are the things that I love to talk about. And then I have also guests that I'll interview that are health experts in their respective fields, whether it be in health or nutraceuticals or in fitness. Lots of different subjects on there that I do as interviews as well. So I think your audience would also appreciate. It's probably similar in scope to yours. And it's a lot of fun, a lot of natural health tips, and I make it easy for people. Keep it simple.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, I encourage people to check that out. Well, as we wrap up, I always encourage my guests or ask my guests that if they could give us one health tip that could make us healthier today, what would you say to that?
Yeah. So my favorite right now, and I don't know, maybe it's a phase of life. Yeah. My favorite these days is connection. Okay. And I say that because you can connect not only with people, also your pets, even your food. Like if you take the time to be mindful about what you eat each and every day and are connected to it, maybe it's you grow the food, maybe it's you just carefully select what you're going to eat and you cook it, or maybe it's you share that meal with a family or a loved one, somebody you care about, and you connect over that meal. The power of connection is one of those things that it's a little bit hard to sort of tabulate the exact impact and influence, but the data shows that you can live, between 7 and 14 years longer if you have this in your life, if you have the power of connection. And I really believe that it's the reason that all of these blue zones that you've heard of, those in Sardinia and Greece and Loma Linda and Japan and Costa Rica, for example, I've been there to the peninsula there. All of these people, one of the things they share in common, besides just eating whole foods and real food, is the power of connection. As they age, they're still super connected with their respective environment. The elders are an integral part of their environment. They connect with the people, and this power, and don't underestimate it. And right now, I think it's too easy to connect negatively, right? There's just a lot of negativity, whether it be on social media or it's the news or whatever. Be a game changer in your own sphere to be somebody who positively connects with people. Just put positive things out there in the world, whether it be, like I said, smiling at somebody who you see on a walk, or helping somebody that you see is struggling, whether it be lifting their groceries or whatever it is. Just like find some way every day to just connect with people, and it'll make all the difference in your life. So that's my favorite advice.
Okay. Well, very
Today.
good. Well, fantastic advice just all the way around. So appreciate what you do, and just the more we can get this message out there, the better. Certainly our country needs to hear it. So Dr. Thomas Hemingway, really appreciate your time, and appreciate everyone listening today, and we will talk to you next time.
Aloha. Thanks so much, Dr. Greg.